Greetings, traveler. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 10 years now. And the other day, I was working on my game about airships. And I had to design a feature about Steam and how you use Steam on an airship. And for a moment, I had a mind blank. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't get any progress on what the Steam feature would look like, how it would function in the game, what I had to write in my game design document about Steam. And immediately I got unstuck because of this process that I put in place to specifically help me in those times. And that got me thinking. I remember the time when if somebody would ask me to design a feature or moreover design the whole game, I would get this huge mind blank. They would say, okay, please give us a few details about fighting game, for example. I would say, okay, fighting games, what do I know about fighting games? And then nothing, just blank. And I would stay stuck there for days, not being able to put even a single feature down on text. So today, what I want to do is go over how this process happens, how we get stuck on these things, and how often I used to get stuck trying to make a new game feature or a game itself. And also I'm going to tell you my method for getting unstuck using nothing but selfishness. So I mentioned before how selfishness can be a good thing, and today we're gonna look at a different way of how this works. So how do we get stuck? Somebody says something like, think of a new feature. So in my case was use Steam on an airship. Trying to imagine how this would work, how this would play out, what specific mechanics are necessary for using this very cool sounding feature. I couldn't come up with anything, mind blank, no idea what to do, get stuck. But how to get unstuck with selfishness? Well, if you have been following my simple framework for the game design phases, you might have heard that somewhere along there is an overview and a use case for a feature and details and so on. If you haven't seen that framework, I will leave a link down below. But the quick version of this is basically that before you start to create the specific game features of your game, and by game features I mean let's say that your game has lots of weapons or weapon types, then you have to say, okay, within there's these weapons in the game, and this is how they function, what attacks they have, what's their general stats, and within that weapon category, this is how swords are designed, this is what their specific stats are, this is how they're different from axes and bows and so on. So that's an example of a game feature. And when you sit down to design that, it's very useful to have some guidelines about what a feature in the game has to achieve and what the expectations from that feature are. So if you do the little bit extra preparatory work of talking about what the game concept is and what the pillars of the game are, which you might have heard in the games industry being discussed a lot, or what this feature's purpose is within the game, what is it supposed to achieve, what would we not be able to do if this feature didn't exist in the game. When you start thinking of these things, that mind blank that you get starts getting a bit more boxed in, it gets a bit more limited. And this is a case where these limitations help us in design because they give us a frame of reference and they give us some boundaries to work within instead of this big blankness. So that is a good starting point because it limits everything to something, right? We have to think of something within the boundaries we set for ourselves, referencing the overview and the use case and the details and so on. Also the game pillars. So still, we're not quite out of the woods yet. How do we move forward from here? Because we went from a big mind blank to a smaller mind blank. Here is where we use our selfishness. Here is where we get to say, well, how do I want to design this feature? What do I want this feature to achieve, right? So there's all these people in the world, and you could ask the same question to anyone. How would you design it? What would you like to see about this feature in the game? How would you bring it to life? but every person has a different answer. So when you think of how you would implement this, then you also have your personal likes and your personal experiences and your personal opinion about what is cool, what is interesting, and all that to rely upon. So now we got our basic frame by using the overview and the use case and the details and so on. We have our personal likes and what we know to be interesting based on our experiences to draw upon. So things are slowly coming into shape. You know that, okay, Steam airships, what do I like? Okay, probably something that has to do with the Steam generation, maybe the engine. Okay, we're getting somewhere. And then further on, you can think about it from slightly further point of view. So from a more overall point of view, what purpose and what pillar is this feature connected to? So when we put this in the game, so when we, in this case, adding Steam in the game, why did we choose to include this feature? Why was it important enough over all the things that we didn't include in the game to add this to the game? There is a reason for that, right? So referencing that reason is super helpful. And also for the pillar, what are the main points of the game? Gameplay wise, looks wise, sound wise, everything. So that further informs the direction that you can go with this feature and what specific details need to be included when you sit down to write its details. So again, this doesn't give us the answer automatically, but it puts us in a place where we can now brainstorm. So me doing my brainstorm, I thought that, well, if an airship can use Steam, perhaps it can release a Steam cloud to hide itself from enemies. Or perhaps it can direct the Steam towards its cannons and use it to shoot cannonballs at the enemies. Or if it has cannons already, use it to amplify them even more in some crazy fantasy way to do more damage. So with this, we went from nothing to two ways we can implement Steam in the game. And from here on out, the situation becomes much more specific. So we went from how to use Steam in the game to how does a Steam cloud function in the game? So this question is much more specific. And it's specific because we already know that airships have Steam in this case, and they can use it somehow, and they generate it somehow. And when they generate it, one of the uses is to release the Steam to obfuscate the ship, so to hide the ship from enemies. And this is a point where we can start talking about the details of this feature. So, namely, how does the Steam get generated? How long does it take to release the Steam? How much of the ship does it cover? How much protection does it provide? And how long does the Steam cloud last? And when can you do it again? So these are just some simple numbers. You don't have to think too specifically about what these numbers should be right from the beginning. It's okay to go with a general semi-realistic feeling for it, and it's going to change over the game balancing process anyway. But because we used this process to arrive to this question, we can continue using this process and referencing the feature overview and the use case and the details, and more specifically the purpose of the feature, the pillars of the game, the general description of the game, and so on. We don't stop using these things as long as we're doing game design, because they give us a direction of the game, right? So when we get to the point where we ask the question, how do Steam clouds work? And we have to decide, reload time and dispension duration and Steam amount and generation speed and all that stuff. We could think, for example, let's say we need to decide the generation speed of the Steam. Well, if you could have infinite Steam, you could be generating clouds endlessly, right? But that's a bit unrealistic somehow. And also, if it was so slow that you could basically do only one cloud through the entire gameplay, perhaps this wouldn't be such a commonly used feature, or the player wouldn't be incentivized to use it so commonly. Using it so rarely doesn't sound like something we should do, because releasing just a Steam cloud, unless it gives you complete invulnerability or something, doesn't sound like an ability that would be strong enough to only be able to use once. It sounds like something that you should be able to do several times, assuming you prepare the ship for it, you build up enough steam, and so on. So here we get in the ballpark. So we know that we use the feature a few times during the playthrough, and we use the feature based on how often we get generation from the steam. So if you can hear the massive amount of sirens going out outside. Anyway, so now that we have this basic information, so we know that it's not thousands of times per session that we use this Steam cloud, and it's not 0 or 1. So it's probably a few more than 1. And here is really where you can be even more selfish and say, well, how many times would I like to use this Steam feature in a session? Does 5 sound enough? Does 10 sound enough? Does 20? Here's where you get to be super selfish and say, you know what? I think it would be cool if, for example, you could use it sometimes when you're in a pinch, but it wouldn't be available every 30 seconds, for example, to use all the time. For example, perhaps if you're implementing this, you have a different pace in mind, and that's completely fine. But basically, this process managed to take us from a complete mind blank, where we have no idea what to do about Steam, to a specific question and specific features we can start thinking about, and how we reason about the numerals, right? The stats that we put in each feature and the number that becomes each stat. And from then on, it's basically some playtesting, and even before playtesting, it's just your own personal preference about how intensely these things should be used and to what effect. You'll see that once you set a good enough target for these things and the target is clear, so for example, these Steam clouds should be available 30% of the time and they should be used, I don't know, 5 times per session. When you make that a design goal, you'll find that the game balancing process itself becomes extremely straightforward as well. Why? Because you just have to tune the numbers so that in one session, which can be, I don't know, an hour or 2 hours or whatever, you should only have this feature available 5 times. So already you're in a much better situation than most people who normally get lost around a feature like this. Anyway, that's the quick way I have for getting unstuck when you're faced with big design questions like this. I hope you find this useful. If you know someone who is often getting stuck in this kind of scenario, and it definitely used to be me when I was starting out, please feel free to share with them. And until next time, have fun.